And now Pragg, d6 on the board, a very aggressive move. What's going on, chess YouTube? In today's video, Praggnanandhaa shocks Magnus Carlsen with a brilliant attacking game in the London system opening in their first game ever from the year 2021. Now in the game, Praggnanandhaa is playing as white. He opens 1d4, Magnus goes 1 knight to f6, the Indian defense, very ironic for today's game. And now the Indian superstar Pragg, he goes bishop f4, and we have the London system on the board. Alright Magnus, how will he respond? He starts with the move e6, and this move is not as popular as say d5 and c5 immediately. However, Magnus must have his ideas for this game. Alright, here Pragg, e3 on the board, a very standard idea for the London system. And now Magnus, b6, intending a fianchetto of the bishop on b7. However, this move is a little bit slow, and here Praggnanandhaa on move 4, he busts out an absolutely crazy idea. We have the move queen to f3 on the board for Pragg, immediately targeting the rook on the a8 square. Pragg is going all out on move 4 already. Alright Magnus, he has to respond. He cannot allow queen takes a8, and you can't go bishop b7 as that runs into queen takes b7 as well. So here Magnus, he has to block the diagonal, he has to do it fast. In the game, he goes knight to c6, a perfectly reasonable idea. And now Pragg, knight c3. Very interesting choice in the spirit of the Jobava London system. And now Pragg is likely intending long castles and then starting an attack on the kingside, maybe with g4 and g5. Alright, here Magnus, bishop b7 on the board, and Pragg does castle long, so long castles on the board. And already Pragg has his king safe on the queenside. Magnus Carlsen's king is stuck in the center, and what is he going to do from here? Alright, from here, Magnus is at a branching point. He has a wide variety of plans that he could choose. For example, bishop b7 going short castles is playable, as is bishop b4, and even queen to e7 tending long castles. Instead, he goes for none of those ideas, and he immediately seeks counterplay on the queenside with the move a6. Now here Magnus is intending b5 and then maybe even b4, trying to knock off that knight on c3 and starting an attack on the queenside against Pragg's king. So what is Pragg going to do about it? Well, he expands in the center with the move e4. And you don't see this move in the London opening very often, but here Magnus is not fighting for the center, and Pragg says, you know what, I'm going to take it if you're not fighting for it. So Pragg, e4 on the board, and now Magnus does go b5, expanding on the queenside. Now Pragg, he's not done. He goes d5, a very aggressive move, knocking back that knight on c6, and now the knight has to go somewhere. Now, real fast, can you take that pawn on d5? Well, it turns out you can, but it's not a very good idea. After e takes, then e takes, the e file is opened up, and Pragg may want to follow up with the move rook to e1, pinning the rook against the black king on e8. That would not be good for Magnus Carlsen. So with that in mind, Magnus does keep the e file closed in this game, and instead of that, he goes knight to e7. A very weird rerouting move for the knight. However, Magnus does have his idea. He wants to go knight to g6, putting pressure on that bishop on f4, and from there, the knight will be reasonably well placed. So, interesting idea by the greatest chess player of all time. Now here Pragg, what should he be doing in this position? Well, it turns out the very aggressive idea g4 is quite playable. You're threatening g5, again, starting the attack on the king side. Instead, Pragg does take a second to defend on the queen side. He goes a3, trying to stop the idea of b4 for Magnus Carlsen. Alright, here, Magnus here. Knight to g6 on the board, continuing his plan. And now Pragg, what should he do about that pressure on the bishop? Again, g4 is playable, but instead of that, Pragg plays a more human-looking move. Simply bishop g3, getting the bishop out of the line of fire. And of course, you do want to keep your dark-squared bishop alive in this position. Those two bishops are just too important this early in the game. Alright, here Magnus, he's got his knight over on g6. What is the next step in his plan? Well, the best idea is going to be taking control of the center with the move e5. That would stop future e5 and d6 ideas from Pragg. However, he doesn't go for that. Instead, Magnus just seeks counterplay on the queen side immediately, and he goes b4, trying to put pressure on that knight on c3. Now, of course, Pragg is going to take on b4. That was the whole idea of a3 in the first place. So a takes b4, and then bishop takes on the board. And here Pragg gets one more piece into the game with a very good move, bishop c4, a good defensive and offensive move. Of course, the bishop does put pressure on the king side, and it also defends white's queen side. Of course, this move was not strictly required. You can just go for the attack with the move h4 right away, but bishop c4, a very solid idea by Pragg here. Now, in this position, Magnus does castle, short castles on the board, and we officially have the opposite sides castling position. And this game is going to get very aggressive very fast, as both sides are attacking on opposite sides of the board. Pragg on the king side, obviously, and Magnus on the queen side here. Alright, Pragg, knight g to e2 is the move, supporting the knight on c3, and if bishop takes, then knight takes c3 will be the move, so a solid choice. And now here, Magnus, one more time. This is his last chance to go e5. trying to gain control of the center of the board. However, once again, he doesn't play that move. He plays a very provocative idea, queen to e7, and here he is just begging Pragg to go e5 and d6 with insane complications in the middle of the board. So let's see if Pragg can find the idea. Now, before attacking in the center, Pragg here does attack on the king side with the move h4, the alpha 0 pawn entering the game. Now, of course, the threat is h5, knocking back the knight on g6, and once that happens, he may even go h6, trying to create more weaknesses on the king side with that h-pawn. So, of course, Magnus Carlsen here, he spots the idea. He does advance h5, blocking the pawn, and that move is virtually forced. It's not strictly required, but if you don't play it, you are going to be in a world of trouble. So h5 on the board, and now here Pragg, he turns up the heat. e5 on the board, knocking back that knight on f6. Where is the knight going to go? Of course, you can't take on e5 with another knight, because then bishop takes e5 wins the knight. Therefore, the knight has to move, and in the game, Magnus does go knight to g4, and this turns out to be a little bit of a mistake. Instead, you do have to take on d5, knight takes d5, allowing knight takes and then further exchanges, and Pragg would have a pretty good attacking position there. But instead, Magnus, knight to g4 on the board, and this move turns out to be quite a bit weaker. Now, the idea behind it, he's trying to gang up on that pawn on e5. Of course, now he has two knights attacking it, and just one piece defending, that being the bishop on g3. And beyond that, it's not so easy to defend the pawn on e5. For example, rook h to e1 doesn't defend it. Almost no matter what, you are losing that pawn. However, Praggnanandhaa, he spots a brilliant idea in this position. He does not worry about that e5 pawn at all. Instead, he goes d6, hitting the black queen on e7, but also opening up the line of attack of this bishop on his own queen. And now on move 16, both queens are literally hanging in this position. All right, Magnus, what is he going to do about the threats? Well, first of all, you cannot take on f3. That is literally suicide. Here, after bishop takes f3, the move is d takes e7, and suddenly you are attacking the rook on f8, and if you allow that, you take the rook with check. So with that combination, Magnus would lose material on the spot. So that being said, bishop takes f3 is not a possibility. That is just a blunder, and you lose on the spot. So instead, c takes d6 on the board for Magnus, the best move. But now Pragg, he swoops in and wins the bishop on b7. Queen takes b7, and here Praggnanandhaa, he is officially up a piece. He has the 4 minor pieces versus the 3 of Magnus Carlsen. Now, of course, queen takes b7 was not required. Instead, the computer does like the idea of e takes d6 on the prior move for various reasons. You can investigate that on your own. But instead, queen takes b7 on the board. And now Magnus, what is he going to do about his material deficit? Well, he counterattacks in the center immediately with his extra pawn, that being the extra d pawn, and he goes d5. Trying to put pressure on that bishop on c4 and opening up the queen's line of attack on the queen side. So a very good multi-purpose move. However, Praggnanandhaa, the brilliant Indian superstar, he is not done attacking. He is not slowing down. He's not turning around. Instead, here, he just jumps forward with the knight. Knight takes d5 on the board. An absolutely brilliant idea. And not only is this move strong, there was simply no other good alternative. Real fast, if you don't take on d5 with the knight, let's say you go bishop b3 trying to defend, then the move is rook to b8, and suddenly black is getting a massive attack on the queen side with the rooks and the queen. So instead here, Pragg, instead of going bishop b3, knight takes d5 is the move for Pragg, simply going forward with the attack at all costs. Now here, of course, the knight is hanging. Magnus will take it. E takes d5, and then here Pragg, the best move is going to be rook takes d5. The rook is surprisingly active and surprisingly safe on d5. However, instead, queen takes d5 is the move for Praggnanandhaa. Now, of course, this puts pressure on that pawn on f7. If Magnus does go, say, rook f to b8, you will have to be careful about the defense of that f7 pawn. So, interesting idea. Now here, Magnus, he finally wins that pawn on e5. Knight 6 takes e5 on the board. And now Pragg, his bishop on c4 is being attacked. Therefore, bishop c3 is the obvious, or bishop b3, sorry, is the obvious move, just getting out of the attack. Of course, bishop takes e5 was possible, but again, you want to keep those bishops on the board at all costs. That bishop pair is just too valuable for Pragg in this game. Now here, Magnus, he knows he has to attack, and he starts to increase the pressure on the queen side with the move a5. Now the threat is a4, and then potentially a3, so the alpha 0 a-pawn on the queen side being a huge asset for Magnus now. All right, here Pragg, he stops the threat with the move bishop a4. A very solid idea. Now the pawn is blockaded, and you do have pressure on that pawn on d7. Now Magnus, what's he going to do about it? In the game, rook a to c8 is the move. Of course, that pawn on a5 is not going anywhere. Therefore, the rook is just obsolete on the a8 square. Therefore, swinging over to the c8 square and reactivating itself on the open c file, or the semi-open c file. Now, Pragg, knight d4 on the board, activating the knight and potentially threatening knight to f5 ideas that would put pressure on the queen on e7. Now, Magnus, rook c5 hits the queen, and Pragg does retreat with the queen back to the b3 square. So queen b3 on the board, an interesting choice. Of course, the computer does like queen to e4 instead, trying to keep the queen centralized, but overall, b3 not a bad square for the queen either. Now here, Magnus, queen to f6 on the board, applying pressure on this long diagonal with the queen, assuming the pieces open up off the d4 and the e5 squares. Now Pragg, f3 is the move, putting pressure on that knight on g4. However, this turns out to be a little bit of a mistake. Here, Magnus has the resource, queen to h6, putting pressure on the king on c1. The king would have to move. It would go to b1, for example, and then the idea is knight to e3, jumping in with the knight and capitalizing on the newly weakened e3 square after Pragg went f3. However, fortunately for Pragg, Magnus did not find this. He actually goes back with the knight to the h6 square, knight to h6, and this turns out to be a big mistake and a very passive idea. Now Pragg, king b1 on the board, a very simple waiting move. Now we have knight to c4 for Magnus, jumping in with the knight, putting pressure on the queen side. But here Pragg, he has some very good tactical resources to apply more pressure on Magnus Carlsen's position. Now the best idea here, believe it or not, is going to be knight to b5, ignoring the threat of knight d2 check, hitting the king and the queen. However, there are also other safer resources. For example, bishop e1 does defend the d2 square for now. Instead of those here, Pragg does go rook to d3. Now this move makes sense. You potentially want to go rook h to d1, doubling up rooks on the d file. However, the problem is it doesn't do anything about the threat of knight to d2, hitting both the queen and the king on b1. So knight d2 on the board, and now the rook does have to move a second time to take the knight. So here, Pragg, rook takes d2, giving up the rook, or the exchange, chess YouTube. I know you like to be nitpicky about that one. Giving up the rook / the exchange to trade off the knight. So rook takes, then bishop takes, then queen d3, hitting the bishop on d2 with the queen. The bishop has to move. Bishop f4 on the board, and now bishop f2, putting x-ray pressure on that rook on c5. So Pragg here, he is not done attacking. He still wants to put as much pressure on Magnus as humanly possible. All right, here, Magnus. Rook b8 is the move, ignoring the x-ray attack of the bishop of the rook on the c5 square. All right, Pragg, rook d1, activating the rook, bishop e5 for Magnus. And now here, look at this position from Magnus Carlsen. I mean, just take a moment and appreciate this. The rook slicing down the b and the c files, the queen and the bishop slicing down on this diagonal, literally everything lining up with the white king. So here, Pragg, what is he going to do about all these threats? Well, in the game, he finds the strongest idea, simply c3, simply trying to block on this long diagonal. There is just too much pressure coming down here with the bishop and the queen. So c3, very good move, bolstering that knight on d4. Now Magnus, in this position, he has to find the right idea. That rook on c5, of course, is still being hit by the bishop via the x-ray attack. Of course, if the knight moves, say, literally anywhere, that bishop will have the attack on the rook. Therefore, just moving the rook and getting out of the attack is the right idea. So, for example, rook c7 would be a very good idea by Magnus. But instead, he doesn't play that. He actually goes queen b6. Now, this move looks logical. You are putting pressure on that pawn on b2, and beyond that, you are literally threatening checkmate on the b2 square. However, this move has a big flaw. Here, Praggnanandhaa, he blocks the check and opens up a double attack on the rook with the very precise move, knight to b3. And now look at this. The knight hits the rook, the bishop hits the rook, and the rook cannot move, because if you move the rook, then you lose the queen on b6. So Magnus literally walking into all this trouble with his move queen b6 on the move prior, and Pragg punishing it immediately. All right, Magnus, he goes d6, bolstering the rook on c5. He does not even bother trying to move the queen and trying to get the rook out of there. He knows that rook is going down no matter what. So bishop takes c5, then d takes c5 on the board. And now Pragg, queen to c4, blocking that pawn on c5. Now we have both pawns, the a5 pawn and the c5 pawn, firmly blockaded in this game. All right, Magnus, the GOAT, the greatest chess player of all time. It goes queen g6, hitting the king. King to a2 for Pragg. ignoring the idea of queen d4. That would trade the queens immediately. However, Praggnanandhaa, he's an aggressive attacking player. He wants those queens on the board so he can smoke Magnus Carlsen. All right, king a2 on the board as discussed. Now we have queen takes g2, winning that free pawn on the g2 square. That being the other idea of queen g6, hitting both the king and that pawn on the b2 square. But now Pragg, queen takes c5, picks up the other pawn on c5, and we have pressure on the pawns on a5 and the bishop on e5. That bishop is very, very loose. All right, Magnus, bishop f6, defends the bishop. And now Pragg, in this position, he has a wide variety of moves that he could play to maintain the pressure on Magnus Carlsen. Now, the best idea here is going to be a rook to d2, of course, blocking the queen's pressure on the second rank and blocking all that pressure with the queen and the rook on that b2 pawn. So rook d2 would be the best move by far. However, Pragg here, he does not spot that idea in time. Instead, he gobbles up that free pawn on the h5 square. Queen takes h5 on the board, and this turns out to be a massive mistake by Pragg in this game. But can Magnus punish it? There's only one move that does it. If you like puzzles, go ahead and pause the video right now and try to find the key idea for Magnus in this position. And while you're at it, go ahead and smash that YouTube like button. Thank you so much for doing that. It helps me out so much. All right, the key idea for Magnus here in this position, of course, it is bishop takes c3, and suddenly that pawn on b2 is pinned to the king via the queen on the second rank. So that would be absolutely devastating. However, Magnus, he doesn't find it in the game. Instead, queen c2, trying to increase the pressure on the knight and the rook on the d2 square. However, Pragg, he's ready. Rook c1 on the board, very good move, hits the queen. Also, rook d2, perfectly playable. Either way, the knight on b3 does defend the rook, so Pragg here is doing just fine. All right, queen to f5 for Magnus, trying to get the queens off the board. Here, Pragg, he finally goes for it. Queen takes, then knight takes. And here in this position, Praggnanandhaa has 4 seconds on the clock versus 10 for Magnus Carlsen. There is no increment, meaning they don't get any extra time for playing each move. So Pragg has to make literally every move now with just 4 seconds total left on the clock. Let's see if he can win the game. All right, knight c5 for Pragg, jumping in with the knight. Then knight d6 for Magnus Carlsen, a big mistake as you allow the move knight d7, and Pragg jumps in. Knight d7 on the board, hits the rook on b8 and the bishop on the f6 square. What's going to happen from here? Well, the rook has to move. In the game, rook b7 on the board, then knight takes and g takes, that being forced. Now Pragg, he gives the check on g1. Rook g1 check on the board. The king goes to the f8 square. Now bishop c2, reactivating the bishop on a different diagonal. Now Magnus, king to e7, centralizing the king. Bishop e4 hits the rook. And here Magnus, instead of defending the rook, he actually goes f5 in this position. He knows Pragg is down to about 2 seconds here, and his goal is to surprise Pragg with whatever crazy move he can play. And he literally played f5 in this game. Trust me, I'm leaving the link to the Banter Blitz video in the description for this video. If you don't believe me, check out the official Chess24 live stream. Again, link in the description of this video. All right, here, Pragg, he takes the bishop on b7 of Magnus. Bishop takes b7 on the board. And here, Magnus Carlsen, you might think he would take that bishop on b7, but he does not. He goes king to f6. Now, here's the logic. I'm sure Praggnanandhaa had some sort of pre-move planned in the case of knight takes b7. So Magnus here, trying to mess with his opponent, having roughly 1 second left on the clock with a weird move he didn't expect. All right, rook to e1 on the board, then knight c4, jumping in with the knight. Now Pragg, rook d1, and here Magnus Carlsen, he plays a diabolical move. Knight takes b2, again, trying to startle Pragg in time pressure, trying to make him lose on time. All right, here, rook d3, Praggnanandhaa accidentally sacrificing the rook. He did not expect knight takes b2, and now Magnus, he doesn't take the rook. He goes king to e5, centralizing the king. Now we have rook d4 for Pragg, defending the rook on d4. Now knight d3, Magnus again throwing a curveball, jumping in with the knight on the d3 square. Now here Pragg, f4 hits the king. The king has to move. Magnus goes king to f6. And here in this position, despite being up an entire rook, Praggnanandhaa, his clock runs out to 0. Magnus has roughly 5 seconds left. Pragg has 0 seconds, and Pragg actually loses on time in the first game he ever played against Magnus Carlsen. Wow, what a game between Praggnanandhaa and Magnus Carlsen. And again, Pragg showing his fearless, aggressive style of chess, even against the greatest chess player of all time, Magnus Carlsen. Alright, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, smash that like button and check out this video right here, where Magnus Carlsen plays an insane attacking game against Praggnanandhaa. That game's incredible, so check it out, and I'll see you in the next video.